everyone who... Oh, thanks, Ella. About that. My name is Lance Chia. I'm Director of Innovation, Liverpool Innovation Precinct, and then Dr. Diana Su is my colleague in New Zealand from the Consortium for Medical Device Technologies. So yeah, welcome to this work. As you might have just heard, the session is being recorded, so I hope everybody's okay with that. Just a few little rules, the ones we're kind of used to. You just go on mute while the speakers are speaking. But we'd love to still be on your faces, but that's completely up to you. Yes, we have 4 speakers today. Sure that we give the speaker time to actually present what they're going to present. We won't take questions at the end of the session, but we have allowed quite a bit of time at the end for a Q&A, but also a panel session where we have 2 other speakers introduced to you as well. So if you can keep it till then, we'd love for you to ask them live, raising your hand, and we'll pick that up and pass your question to whoever is either the speakers or the additional panel speakers. But if you don't feel like asking it live, you can put it in the chat box, and Diana will try and monitor that as we go along. Move on to the speakers, just a little bit about what the Trans-Tasman BioBridge is. It's an initiative between Liverpool Innovation Precinct and the CMDT in New Zealand, really working together to try and achieve quite a few goals, largely around advancing medtech research, really advocating for medtech does for Australia and New Zealand economies, and trying to get recognition for that. Now, the big things that we try to do is also curate some collaborative research. I mean, these workshops are an important part of that, where we can bring people together to participate around the of interest to them, something they have in common. We've had some great success in researchers on both sides of the Tasman collaborating in projects now who would never have met if it wasn't for the workshop that we had. So while we have this morning 148 participants in this workshop today, spanning the UK through Australia, New Zealand, Asia, even into the US, you're all participants in that part. That if somebody here that is researching, working in the area that you're in, then we can help connect you and hopefully advance that collaboration. I think that's about it from me. Unless I really want to get on, so I'll pass to Diana now, and she can introduce our first speaker.
Okay, thanks, Lance. Hi, everyone. Kia ora. So before I begin, Lance and I would really like to acknowledge Ella, our coordinator, so give a little wave, Ella. Ella's been working really tirelessly in the last month to pull this workshop together. And we would also like to acknowledge funding from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment in New Zealand for funding the BioBridge initiative. So as usual with our workshops, the topic is sparked by interest on both sides of the Tasman. And this time, this topic was actually suggested by one of our speakers, Professor Mark Parsons. We pulled together a panel of clinicians, researchers, and industry experts that cover a wide range of topics around the development, use, and safety of AI in healthcare. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our first 2 speakers from New Zealand. So the first is Professor Jill Dobby, a computer scientist at the University of Auckland. Now, Jill has 2 areas of interest, which is extremely relevant to the use of machine learning in medical devices and software, which I think she's going to cover today. So the first is around understanding how changes in distributions in streams of real-time data can be used in applications like monitoring medical devices. And the second area is in identifying whether there is bias in machine learning models. Jill chairs the Artificial Intelligence Research Association in Aotearoa and is on the board of the Precision Driven Health Joint Research Partnership, which is a partnership between Orion Health, a health IT company in New Zealand, the University of Auckland, and Whitaker District Health Board, which is one of the 3 health boards in New Zealand. So over to you, Jill.
Thanks, Di. I'll just share my screen. So are you seeing that? Yep. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to apologise for my lockdown here, which you probably can't see at the moment, but we are still in lockdown in Auckland and unable to get to the hairdresser. So the title of my talk is Using Machine Learning to Support Decision-Making in Healthcare. As Di said, I'm a computer scientist by training, and because of this, I like to problem solve. I've got a broad range of experience in data management, data integration, privacy, software engineering, and machine learning. All this expertise is useful when it comes to solving problems in healthcare. I'm currently working on a number of projects with healthcare professionals, including a healthy lifestyle check project with Yvonne Anderson and an HRC-funded project in dementia with Sarah Cullum. However, I won't be talking about either of those projects today. So the question that I'd like to address today is, can we use routinely collected data and machine learning to improve health outcomes? I'm going to address this question using a couple of example projects that my students and I have worked on alongside a medical physicist. So in oncology, linear accelerators are checked regularly to ensure they are delivering doses within allowed tolerances. If they're not, the machine needs to be recalibrated, which can upset the daily schedule and also upset patients and their whānau. In this first project, we built a machine learning model that predicts when a LINAC machine will need to be recalibrated. It's not to replace regular checks, but instead provide information between checks. So the way supervised machine learning works is that we train a machine learning model with labeled data and historic data, and that is fed into our machine learning algorithm. Once we have our model, we can feed new data in, and it will predict if recalibration is needed. So for this particular project, we had 6 years of data, which we split into training data and a validation set. So the data looked kind of similar to this. Where we have pre-adjustments, those are the labels which are indicating that pre-calibration was needed. Our medical physicist on the team provided explanations of the data and insights into the problem and solution. So it was essential to the project. The machine learning algorithm that we used was a recurrent neural network called long short-term memory, which is ideal for making predictions with time series data. The data used is from January 2014 to July 2020. We split it into a training and validation set, as I mentioned, and what we see in this graph, the blue lines are our training data, the yellow lines are the predicted values, and the red lines are the validation, are the real values. So what we can see here is that after training our model, we were able to predict the trends quite well using this machine learning technique. Further work that we could do on this would be to try and improve the accuracy of our predictions. The second project that we worked on was with the same medical physicist, The problem that we're addressing here is predicting when a patient is likely to need a replan as part of their radiotherapy treatment. So replanning is needed to ensure the treatment is applied accurately, particularly when there's a change in shape or size of the patient or their tumour. We did limit this project to tumours around the head of the unfortunately, we didn't have much data to train the model on. This was because of disruptions caused by COVID lockdown and also the DHB that we were working with being hacked. So we had data from only 100 patients. 50 of the patients had needed a replan and 50 had not needed a replan. So the advantage of having 50 and 50 is that we started off with a balanced data set. For each patient, we had 30 features or 30 variables. In our first attempt to build a model, we used a decision tree classifier. This helped us understand what the important features were in the model. So the features that were important were the weight, morphology, the stage of the patient and through the cancer treatment, and the planning target volume and the clinical target volume. From memory with the decision tree, we got around 66% accuracy. We then investigated how we could improve the accuracy. We tried different machine learning algorithms, so these are the ensemble classifiers, and we also tried adding more of the 130 features that we had available. So the features that we thought might play into this were sex, age, weight loss, and those sorts of things. The reason that we tried ensemble classifiers is that it's known that they can give us higher accuracy, but it's at a cost of understandability of what's going on. So from our experiments, we verified that random forest with the original features that were chosen gave us the highest accuracy. So we achieved an accuracy of around 77%, which our medical physicist was very happy with. In fact, he took the model away and just tried it on a number of other patients and found that the accuracy was pretty robust across other patients as well. To improve the accuracy further, we'd like to train it on a larger data set. And we'd also like to try to include image data, so scans, to see if that will improve the outcomes. So what we found from all of this is that machine learning can be used to support processes in healthcare, even when there is only routinely collected data available. And for the results to be effective in the real world, it's important that the team includes clinicians and medical learning specialists. So thanks, and I'm keen to answer questions later on.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Thank you for that. Now I know how you built an algorithm. I'm not a computer scientist, so that was really cool. Thank you. So our next speaker, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Associate Professor Robin Whitaker. She's a public health physician and clinical director of innovation at Whitaker District Health Board. Robin has many accolades as in her bio, which you can check, but I would like to acknowledge that she's also a really good collaborator of mine. Robin is an international expert in mobile health development and implementation, predominantly in the development of interventions for behavior change and self-management support, most recently diabetes and COPD. Now, one challenge for the healthcare system currently is developing a governance for the implementation of AI, and Robin has been spearheading that at Whitaker. So with this, I hand over to Robin to share some of her work with us.
Thanks, Di. Sorry about that. Kia ora koutou, ko Robin Whitaker toko ingoa. It's a great privilege to be here today speaking with you on this slightly different topic. I'm not sure if you were expecting this, but I guess this is coming from the perspective of trying to do AI research and development within the health services and some of the challenges that we've come across. So at Waitemata DHB, we have been working on building the foundations for many years now to move from what's on the left there, that's our patient file archive off-site, to a fully digital service where all of the clinical processes fairly much are becoming digitized. All the nurses work on iPad minis, all the processes are as much as digital as we can, moving towards the inpatient snapshot, which is on the right there, which is bringing together all the electronic information on an inpatient into one place. In New Zealand, we have very much a best of breed system. We don't have EMRs generally in our hospitals. So we have this way of bringing information together for clinical uses, and then down the bottom also for analytic and service improvement uses. So in doing this work over the last kind of 5 years of digitizing the health system, obviously the byproduct is a huge amount of data that really suddenly allows us to be able to do big data research and machine learning and AI. And so the process that we've kind of been on is from the bottom left there, we started with individual AI kind of development and research projects. And Di's already mentioned Precision Driven Health, which we are a partner of. So we have had some of our research projects under that umbrella. And in doing so, we discovered that there's a whole lot of issues around doing AI research that really still needed to be addressed, in particular in how we went from research into practice is a really big leap. And so we started to do some background work on that. The first was the State of AI in Healthcare, a report from a fellow on how other places around the world were implementing AI in clinical practice. So how that translation was happening in other places. Then we did another bit of work there with another fellow. You can see the partnerships report, which was really trying to figure out what would be the important things in terms of contracts and agreements with academic institutions, universities, and also companies. How are we going to deal with some of the big gnarly issues around the handling of our data and IP and other things like that, and responsibility and accountabilities as we move into implementation. And then we have this wonderful bit of work on the right here towards ethical health AI at Waitemata that was prepared by another fellow, Prageeth Jayathissa, and our Maori Health Research Group, Kerry Hine, around how to do it well. What would good look like in terms of developing ethical and sustainable and understandable AI within the context of our actual health information systems that we have and the data that we have, and how would we approach things like bias. So with those reports behind us, another key part was actually doing some consumer perspectives. So with Rosie Dobson at NIHI, we did a very large patient survey of people who were using our services, both inpatients and outpatients, to ask them what did they think that we were doing with their health information at the moment, and what was their level of comfort around doing various things with it. And that research is still ongoing at the moment. And then alongside those things, as we were developing up all of this background work, I've been working on developing a new structure for regional data governance in the Northern region, which has also fed into this, alongside some work with the WHO on this really, I think it's a great document, but it's very comprehensive and large if you need some help sleeping, on ethics and governance of AI for health. So this was an international group that came together to look at these issues around ethics and around governing AI in healthcare services. It talks through all of these things, which are some of the big ethical challenges that we face in implementing AI in the health service. And at the very end of the document, if you just want to jump straight to the end, there are some checklists, one for ministries of health, one for developers, and one for health services to think through when they're thinking about implementing any AI in the health service. So these were the things that we knew that we were going to need to address. So we decided to put together our new AI governance group within our health service so that we could start talking through some of these issues and working out where we were going to land. So that's what we've done. This is from the terms of reference from our AI governance group within our health service. Really predominantly around setting an overarching direction and then reviewing requests. So requests might come in for research or for implementation of AI, and we need to know how are we going to make those decisions. And so this is kind of the different parts of the service that have come together to be a part of our new AI governance group, because we knew these were all of the areas that were going to need to be addressed and where we needed expertise. And so we've brought all of this group together. We've given them all of that background information, and we've worked through some of the issues, and what we've been developing is a checklist for ourselves that I'm not going to be able to go through all of this today in 10 minutes, so I'll pick out a few things to talk about. But basically we have these 9 general areas of consideration that the group goes through when we get a proposal. The first question is always, is it actually even appropriate to consider using AI for this problem? So that was something that despite all of these other groups already having their governance, there was nobody really whose job it was to say, is this even a good idea in the first place? So that is one of the points of this group, is to first say, is this even a good idea? Do we think it is? And then to bring in all these different perspectives from the 8 domains around the circle there to try and make sure that we cover off all of the things that we're going to need to think about, which are those there on the right. So these are kind of our general principles, I guess, around what we consider for every proposal that will come to us. Just some key things here that I'll pick out from that. One, this first question of, is AI appropriate here? This is one of the documents that we also found really useful in building up our thinking around this. This is from the NHSX. It's called A Buyer's Guide to AI in Health and Care. Really nice, simple guide. And this was their kind of 5-point questions of, is AI even appropriate here? So is the problem, associated with a large quantity of data that can be used? Is it on such a scale that it would be difficult for humans to do? Can we test it against empirical evidence? Would it actually lead to problem solving in the real world? And is that data actually available for use in this way? So some really good, simple questions, I think. And then, of course, we have to have the ethical principles. This is just to point out, so these are the ethical principles from that WHO document that I just showed before. So there's a big description around these in there and about how we got to them, because we did go around a lot. And these, of course, on top of your usual medical bioethics principles. So these are specific for AI. But the other really important document for us in New Zealand is the National Ethical Standards. And so in 2019, they rewrote these standards, and there's really, really good chapters in there on the reuse of secondary data and on AI. Those chapters 12 and 13. Maori perspectives obviously are really important in New Zealand, and I'm not obviously the expert here, but we drew heavily on Te Mana Rauronga, which is a Maori Data Sovereignty Network in New Zealand, who have developed some principles and a charter, and we use those quite extensively, as well as I've said, Prageeth and Kerry did a lot of great work on adapting this for our purposes in our document. So there are some specific risks for Maori that arise quite a bit from the potential for there to be bias. For a whole lot of reasons, but including, minority population, digital access inequities, outliers, and a lot of health outcomes, but also bias based on our use of historical data, that if we don't understand that potential for bias in our past data well, there's the potential for that to be perpetuated into the future if we rely on AI that's relying on biased data. So Prageeth and Kerry have suggested a way of working towards ethical and trustworthy AI based on some of the principles around Maori governance, analysis of performance for Maori, and some best practice guidelines. There's lots of contractual issues. I probably don't really need to go into these terribly much, but these are all the types of issues that we are trying to embed in our, we will be trying to embed in our agreements. Those were probably fairly straightforward to everyone on this audience. As I've said, consumer perspectives. So our big survey that Rosie did really found that a very large majority of people were very happy for their data to be combined and aggregated and used for these kinds of purposes. These were kind of the key things that were brought up. Really, it was as long as their personal privacy was maintained, as long as the data was secure, and as long as it's done for the right reasons, but that people felt that very much the benefit of others and the improvement of healthcare services was very much a reason that we should be doing this. So that was very good. There was only a very small, I think it was 3% of people who kind of were not happy, and those people often had very specific issues. But one thing that did come out of it is that we need to communicate a lot better with our population around the use of their health information to do this kind of work. And so that will be something that we're going to be working on next. Clinicians, I won't go into terribly much, but basically we have a philosophy of clinicians having to be involved in every project that uses our health information. And that's to ensure, clinicians have a very high bar around the level of evidence that's required, and we need them to be trusting something that obviously we're putting in place, but also we need to know that it's going to fit into our clinical workflow and be useful. It has to be, we have also taken the philosophy that it does need to be understandable by our clinicians, and they have told us that they need to be able to understand it in order to explain it to patients and whānau. And we're very clear that it doesn't replace clinical judgment, and at this stage of the development, we're still very much working on the human in the loop type philosophy behind our AI. There's so much you could say about data that I won't go into this too terribly much, but these are some of the big issues about ensuring that the data is actually sufficient, that it's complete and it's representative. Otherwise, we introduce bias. That we need to understand, how it's been collected and recorded, or it could end up being used the wrong way. Prageeth does was wonderful story about how he realized that heart rate, if a heart rate number was divisible by 4, then that meant it was a proxy for someone who's well. And then he went and hung out with some nurses, and he realized that if somebody is well, a nurse generally only does a pulse for 15 seconds and then times it by 4 and then enters that number. Whereas if someone is unwell or there's something up with their heart rate, then they're likely to actually take the pulse for the whole minute and then enter the actual number for a whole minute. So suddenly there's this proxy there for whether the nurse thinks someone is well or not, very little to do with the actual number of the heart rate. So lots of things like that we are learning as we go along. Oh, and the last one, just that we also have a philosophy of data that an AI produces needs to go back into the clinical record for that individual as well. So that's something that we have to convince companies sometimes about, but that we want that data back. So that's what we've done. We've basically developed a checklist that our AI governance group will go through. So under each of these 9 areas up in the corner there is a number of questions that the AI governance group will think through when they're reviewing a proposal to either to start a new project around AI. So we've divided the AI lifecycle into 3 main groups, basically. So the first is the concept or design. So where someone comes to us and say they want to develop a new AI, and that may be a clinician or it may be someone external, or they may come to us asking for access to data for either pre-process or model development. So we put those 2 stages together. Or they may come to us saying that they've got a model already developed and they want to do some validation testing and then implementation. So we've got 3 sets of questions depending on where in the AI lifecycle the project comes to us. They're just the same sort of questions, they're just framed slightly differently. So we're just finalising this. And I hope to publish it once it's finished. It's very nearly there. We've just run a couple of things through it at the validation implementation end, and the next thing for us to do is run something through it from the concept end and just make sure that it works. So that is where we're up to, and I'm very happy to talk more about that if people are interested. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Robin. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think the governance and ethics is an area that a lot of people come and think about and get headaches over. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you at the end in the panel session. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the first of the Australian speakers, Professor Mark Parsons. He's recognised and world leader in stroke and brain imaging research. He's a professor of medicine and neurology at the University of New South Wales, Southwestern Sydney Clinical School. He's also the lead neuroscientist at Liverpool Hospital, as part of the Southwest Sydney Local Health District, and the Ingham Institute for Applied Medical Research. He's also the leader of the Australian Stroke Alliance, and is deeply involved in researching techniques and opportunities for advancing the management of stroke patients across the entire care pathway, which includes the use of AI in brain image analysis, as well as the use of EEG for brainwave assessment in the pre-hospital environment. But Mark's interest in AI and ML are broader than just neurology space. He's also the executive director of Maradulu Budjari Gumal, the Sydney Partnership for Health Education Research Enterprise, or SPHERE. And he's a very strong advocate for developing and implementing new technologies for improving diagnostic accuracy and clinical decision support across a whole range of clinical conditions. So yeah, over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Lance, and hi everybody. Good to see you all online. I like some of your titles. The clinician I particularly like. I'd like to know who that is. They obviously got tickets on themselves. In addition, good to see Sergey there, one of my friends in New Zealand. Hope to see you in person soon one day. And just to clarify a couple of things, Lance, it was actually your idea, this workshop, I think originally, so I don't want to take the credit for it. Obviously, I volunteered to speak, and I'll talk to you more about the Stroke Alliance. But in fact, I'm not the leader. The chair of the Stroke Alliance is Damien Easton, who I think is online. I'm the lead of the clinical council of the Stroke Alliance. But we'll talk more about that as we go along. And just as way of background, as Lance said, I'm actually a neurologist who dabbles in AI. But in addition, yeah, I'm now director of what's called a RTEC, or an Advanced Health Research Translation Centre, sometimes known as SPHERE, and other times known for the Indigenous language, Maradulu Budjari Gumal, as Lance said, which basically translates into working together for health and wellbeing. And you can perhaps see that big eel behind me on my background. That is some of the Indigenous artwork representing our health partnership, and that's meant to represent the eel that travels through all the waterways connecting our partners across New South Wales and Sydney. Anyway, I'm sharing the talk with one of my close colleagues, Andrew Bivard, who is in Melbourne. And I should say I'm actually on Cabrogal land in southwestern Sydney at the moment, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which we're all on, both in Australia and New Zealand, I guess, and wherever else, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'm not sure what land Andrew is on. I think he's somewhere in Fitzroy in Melbourne. And Andrew and I have worked closely over many years, and he's going to talk about the more technical aspects, because as I said, I'm really a clinician that pretends to know something about AI. And you'll work that out from the talks. So what is artificial intelligence? And the way I define it is, we talk about agriculture first. So we often talk about...
You're not full screen.
I'm not full screen.
The slide hasn't advanced.
Oh, okay.
I think it's just selecting which one. It's all good.
Let me just check. Will I stop sharing?
Yep.
Let me get back onto Zoom on my window. Sorry, I thought I was sharing as I was talking, but let me go back to it now. Just let me know if what's happening, AB. I've gone to full screen now.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Sorry, I'll go back. Is that good?
Yep.
Thanks and this is why I had Andrew share the talk with me. He's the technical guru. So we talk a lot about natural intelligence versus artificial intelligence in medicine, but they also do it in agriculture. And just to give you an example, artificial intelligence in agriculture in Germany, you've got 2 cows. You re-engineer them to live for 100 years and only eat once a month, and they milk themselves. In Australia, we've got natural intelligence in agriculture, and the Kiwis will like this joke. You've got 2 cows, business seems pretty good, so you close the office and go for a few beers to celebrate. And then we talk about natural intelligence in stroke management. And I guess, apologies if those of you who don't know how stroke's managed in different countries, but it's quite different around the world. So we talk about natural intelligence in stroke in Italy, a bit similar to the Aussies, I guess. You've got 2 stroke patients, you don't know where they are, so you decide to go for a long lunch. In the UK, you've got 2 stroke patients. They're both mad. Now, that's an analogy to mad cow disease. In fact, they're not really strokes, but you treat them as strokes anyway because you only do very unsophisticated brain imaging because you're in the NHS and you can't afford to do anything fancy. Talking a bit more about stroke. So we've been working, Andrew and I, for many years, in fact, on what I call very basic AI in brain imaging so that we can actually identify in the acute situation how much brain is injured and how much is salvageable. And that can give us an idea about how effective our reperfusion treatments are to remove clots that cause ischemic stroke and brain damage. And I will now hand over to Andrew for the next part of the talk.
Thanks. I just requested.
Yes.
All righty. There we go. So as Mark said, we've done a lot of work around stroke in particular, and I spent my PhD essentially validating perfusion imaging to detect acute infarction and penumbral tissue, which is salvageable. And just this advancement alone, so giving clinicians in the front line more physiological data of their patients was able to lead to a lot of later down the track advancements. It shepherded the extension of the clinical time window from 4.5 hours to 9 with treatment with thrombolysis, and sort of 6 hours to 24 hours for thrombectomy. So these are major advances that really opened up treatment for a lot of patients, particularly in regional areas because they have much more delayed treatment. So just by getting enhanced data to patients, it's pretty obvious trend that you can improve their clinical outcomes as well as the physiological ones. So what the idea with AI is that we want to take that concept and really try and advance it even further. And I've got a real imaging focus for everything that I do. And we all know that AI is often heralded as the 4th industrial revolution. So it's a big deal and it's here to stay. But I think it's oversimplified in a lot of the ways it's communicated. And it's often sold as a sort of a fix-it-all and requiring very little understanding of necessarily the basic physiology of what you're doing. And I think this is where the experts come in and say, okay, so you've got a good algorithm, but it's actually all about the source data that you're putting in there in the very first place. And this goes back to your more core statistical endpoints where you need good data. And so as I was saying, imaging has really been the advance of stroke treatment at this point in time. And clinical assessments actually haven't really yielded a lot of benefit in terms of prognosticating patients or even necessarily diagnosing them because they're overly sensitive. They picked a lot of mimics because the symptoms of a stroke overlap with a lot of other diseases, most commonly migraine or even just early, first onset migraine. And so this is where we want to try to combine all of our models coming in. I'm just running out of time a little bit, sorry. And so what it's gone too far. What we do in stroke is we actually do extract from our images a lot of data, and we actually don't use a lot of it in the very first place. So you can see there on the left, that's a 4D CTA. So there's contrast being injected into a patient, and it's taking a time series and just playing that in front of us. And with that data, we're then able to extract where a perfusion deficit is, so what's not getting enough blood supply, and identify from that region areas that are infarcted or dead, irreversibly unsalvageable, and areas that if you remove that occlusion can reperfuse and salvage the tissue and prevent disability down the track. And you can see here, I doubt you can actually see my arrow, but there is a pretty obvious clot here, and that corresponds to the green area there in the brain. So green is good, go treat that, save that, and the patient will walk out of the hospital a week later. If that is not reperfused, that tissue will die, and probably the patient will too. That is just too much brain to lose to support life moving on. So what we want to do with our more AI-based algorithms is essentially what we take from those perfusion maps is single points of the data and say, this represents that. But there's so much more data there. You've got the time series, you've got your variations off those single cut points. How can we do that? So our team has done some of this with our imaging work. And first thing there we can do is hypodensity detection. So this is something we've just recently done. So off a plain brain non-contrast CT, what area of the brain is hypodense? So this is an estimation of early infarction on the patient. It's not very accurate because it can grow, and hypodensity does take some time to establish, but it's often completely missed or underestimated by clinicians. What's going on there? Why did that move? And by missing that, a lot of stroke patients can actually be missed as well. So the idea of making some of these enhanced feature extraction tools more accessible to clinicians means that people with less experience then get an expert level assessment in the hospital. And this does target more low volume centers, so more regional, or even sort of more hyperacute settings. So maybe ED physicians can sort of see, there's hyperdensity here, time to call the neurology team. So there's actually a lot of sort of health systems use here. That measure in itself probably doesn't actually give you a lot of value in a statistical sense or in a clinical trial sense, but it's that real sort of health systems, how you use it approach. This is very complicated how to do as well, because if you look at the bottom scan, this is sort of an unprocessed image. What you see there is you can see a larger grey swab, but how do we pull that out? The Hounsfield units are very similar to that as around it. So if you were to set a single threshold, you'd actually get a lot of healthy white matter within there as well. So you need to sort of find a single loci point and then grow it out to a region that represents, one, how the normal topography of a stroke looks within its vascular region. And so it doesn't sort of overestimate or underestimate as well. And so this is where our AI algorithms have actually come in and helped us refine how we're doing that. And we've got a fairly decent assessment there where you actually come up, it may be a little bit underestimated, but you can still see that there's an overall estimation there. On the same theme as well, in stroke, it's very important to sort of know where your large clot is. So while on this image, it actually does become a bit obvious to say, oh, there's a lack of vessel filling in this image. Getting to the point of seeing that in an automated sense is tricky as well, because when you take a brain scan, it's not very clean in terms of throwing it down an AI pathway. So across the bottom, you see the processing steps we do. So across the bottom is your pretty raw CTA. So that's just taken there. You can see it's unthresholded. You can't really see much brain in there. So you need to window it. You need to normalize it. You need to make it in the middle. You need to strip the skull, because the skull creates massive artifacts whenever we try to process it, because it's a very high signal and it conflates any kind of other high signal. Then we need to extract the vessel structure from that brain in the next slide. So that's where our contrast is flowed. And so we get a vascular map of the brain. And then we actually need a template of what kind of, where do we expect the vessels to be, so that we can then find out where they are not. And then we can draw a beautiful circle around that and feed that to the clinicians. But really, any stroke clinician with the money should be able to see that in a second, the moment they enter the room. So it's about giving people that data that when they don't have as much experience or exposure to stroke. So with perfusion imaging, this is really where the gold mine is. You get so much physiological data out of the one scan. You get your pre-contrast, post-contrast, cerebral blood flow, cerebral blood volume, mean transit time, and delay time in the brain. And at the moment, we only really use probably about 5% of that data in clinical work. So there's a lot of scope to actually apply those advanced algorithms with expert learning and good data pre-processing to try and make the data somewhat more pretty. So this is what we want to see at the end of the day in our overall graphs, just something that is much more appeasing and really extract more physiological data. And that all is meant to feed into some kind of clinical decision support. So what are clinicians looking for? Treat, not to treat, and outcome prediction generally in their patients, identifying those kind of strokes, so that you can turn around and say, look, our AI assistant is saying, oh, this isn't a stroke, maybe it's kind of a migraine. MP, I think this is back to you, or is this me?
Yep. Okay, sorry, yeah, so just very quickly, we'll move on to, so Andrew, I think you talked a lot about the AI in brain imaging in stroke, but the end game really is to use a combination of clinical and brain imaging data to improve the diagnosis, particularly I think for, as Andrew said, for remote and regional centres that don't have expert stroke people on the scene. In fact, to be honest, most of our big hospitals don't have expert stroke people on the scene after hours either. So it's applicable to all centres, in fact. This might include, as well as imaging variables, some of clinical measures that we routinely collect. NIH stroke scores are a standardised stroke scale that we all do. And indeed, it may even involve looking at some of the other physiologic variables, which Paul Middleton will probably talk about in his talk as well, including brain waves, but also even heart rate variability and oxygen saturation. And just, yeah, as Lance mentioned, the Australian Stroke Alliance, which Andrew is Chief Technical Officer for and I'm involved in, is a big collaboration of over 40 partners, which are put in a major grant through our Medical Research Futures Fund, which was funded last year to basically to deliver cutting edge stroke care to rural and regional Australians. And that's based on three main streams. One is portable imaging. Two is by making all ambulances more connected and capable of diagnosing stroke more accurately and therefore triaging patients to the right hospital, where because treatment delays can cause major differences in outcome. And also there's a stream around air ambulances for really remote Australia, which would obviously apply to parts of New Zealand as well. We've got a few technology partners, but obviously we're potentially amenable to working with others. Basically, so this is some of the tech that we're using. The left-hand side is the current stroke ambulance in what we call an MSU, mobile stroke unit in Melbourne. That's a portable CT scanner from Ceratom, which is owned by Samsung there. But we're about to get new generation stroke ambulances for both Melbourne and Sydney. Hopefully the Sydney one will be located in the centre that provides the best stroke care in Sydney. We all know where that is. And then there are other technologies around portable imaging, which will be more applicable to all ambulances potentially. And just finally, just end with a little joke. As you know, machine learning is all about fancy algorithms. And thanks very much to Andrew. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Andrew. I think everyone on this call meeting probably knows, that the outcomes for stroke is very, very time sensitive. So, if AI can help kind of get to that decision point quick, I think that's good for everybody. I'll just move on to our next speaker now, Associate Professor Paul Middleton. He's a specialist in pre-hospital and emergency medicine. He's worked as part of pre-hospital trauma and helicopter critical care retrieval teams in both the UK and Australia. He's the director of the Southwestern Emergency Research Institute at Liverpool Hospital, and the founder of, these three are a mouthful, founder of the principal investigator for the Multicultural Emergency Medicine Epidemiology Study, the Comprehensive Epidemiological Data Set for Research, Innovation and Collaboration, which I know he's going to talk about, and the Comprehensive Analytics Knowledge and Epidemiology Collaboration, which he's also going to speak about. He has a research degree from Imperial College London in the area of innovative non-invasive diagnostic patient monitoring, and recently received qualifications from MIT Executive Program in Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. Paul is also the founding chair of the Binational Emergency, you've got to join some shorter named groups, Paul, Emergency Department Epidemiology Network for the Australasian College for Emergency Medicine, and immediate past chair of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Resuscitation Council. And in his spare time, he's chair and founder of Take Heart Australia, a charity designed to include all Australians in a mission to increase survival from sudden cardiac arrest. I'll probably use you 10 minutes there, Paul, but I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Lance. Sorry, I couldn't resist the opportunity to give you lots of words to stumble over as you're presenting it. So thanks for that anyway. I'm just attempt to share my screen once again. Okay, have we got a full screen there?
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So thanks for inviting me to talk about AI and health. Our discussions were really about what we've been doing to, I suppose, to to support and provide a platform for that. So in actual fact, it's not precisely AI and health, but more around data and approaches to data. As Lance said, some of our projects are Cedric, Cash, and Cake. And I'll explain just what those mean. They're not just convenient acronyms, but anyway, where we are at the moment in Southwestern Sydney Local Health District, where I'm, as you may have seen from the first slide, I'm the director of the Research Institute for Emergency Medicine, but also the Chief Medical Information Officer, which means I lead for data analytics in the LHD now. And we are driving sort of changes in analytics. Most of you will be aware that, you know, many LHDs are relatively unformed, let's say, in their data analytic capacities, and tend to stop at sort of descriptive analytics and, you know, doing a dashboard, which everybody loves, but they don't really move on from that towards, you know, any form of predictive or prescriptive sort of analytics as well. But we are replacing incrementally our business intelligence unit with essentially a data analytics or a data science unit with people trained in different ways. In New South Wales, there is a cloud first policy, which is worthwhile just knowing about, because it means that the state government are asking us to transfer all of the data that we use eventually to the cloud. That is to some extent an immature process, because people don't understand, especially with unstructured data, the degree of processing and compression, etc., that has to happen before it gets to the cloud. But anyway, we're moving forward through that. We are in the midst at the moment of developing a hybrid sort of on-prem self-managed cloud construction, which allows us to do pre-processing and the LHD in the data center, but then you know, upload significant amounts of data for processing in the cloud as well. So that brings us on in that context to automation of data linkage, and that's Cedric. This is meant to represent the, excuse me, just for Australian figures, the 8 million ED visits a year we get in Australia. It gets to just under 9 million if it's Australia and New Zealand. But these are a lot of people who really we don't know a huge amount about. We don't tend to know generally their clinical epidemiology. We sort of have some overall figures, but don't have any real granular detail. We do a lot of interventions in emergency medicine, many of them quite urgent. We sort of tend to realize when things work in front of us or not, but in the general, in the longer term, we don't really know. And our diagnoses, you know, we have a preliminary diagnosis, but really that's not the point. It's more about doing what's in front of us. And we don't often know whether our initial diagnosis was correct, and we don't know patient outcomes. So that's a problem generally. And it may be the same in New Zealand, but certainly it's true that we don't really have a health system. What we have is a bunch of health silos that bump up against each other occasionally. But it means the information is similarly in silos as well. If you look at an emergency patient journey, somebody who gets sick, goes to the ED, gets resuscitated, investigated, admitted under a specialist team, and then hopefully discharged home to their GP. And every aspect of that has data associated with it, which again, as I say, doesn't really ever reach the next stage. So Cedric is a plan and a project to link all of these data together, not necessarily by trying to link the vendor databases themselves together, but to take the data and to take it to another level and to link it there. Now, this is another way of looking at this. This is Cedric, and what you can see there is that we take data from the Cerner data warehouse and we link it all together automatically. We use automated pipelines, take in the data, and the FirstNet is the emergency department version, PowerChart is the inpatient data collection, pathology and radiology. And we automate, as I say, the linkage of all of that and the ingestion into our data repository. We're also preparing databases, bespoke databases for a number of other clinical specialties. And the reason for that is because many specialties have legacy databases. They have ways of collecting data outside of the EMR, which don't necessarily, some of them are 20 years old and fall over occasionally and don't really work and don't have support, and often don't fulfill their priorities by letting them do what they need to do with the data, let alone actually contribute to an overall data set. So for cardiology, for instance, we're developing a series of databases which look at ingesting data from ECG monitoring machines, from the cath lab, from echocardiograms, and from CTs, CTCAs. But we're also developing similar things for this other groups, all the other groups within the ED. I'll just pause there a second. The point of all of this, though, is not only do they have their own data in a database they can use and to fulfill any clinical quality commitments, but also it then all gets taken to Cedric and linked together with the main data set. So it's really a sort of a data mesh arrangement. I'll just briefly mention this. This is a calculation of lost bed capacity in the emergency department. There's 26 beds in 24 hours, where the red is where patients have been seen and shouldn't be there, but should be somewhere else. And the green is where they're still being sort of processed and treated in the emergency department. And we're producing these maps on a daily basis to facilitate the sort of integration of the ED capacity and the inpatient capacity. This is the dashboard of the inpatient beds that's available. And we're currently building a model to try to look at all of that. And we're building all of these sources of unstructured data into Cedric as well. We're moving towards getting data from ambulance, but also from many other sources as well. And of course, these are going to need very specific tools for analysis. Currently, Cedric contains 1.9 million patient episode data and soon to be expanded by about another 1 million patients. So I then wanted to talk about another aspect of that, and this is CASH. Now, CASH is the Comprehensive Adaptive System Simulation in Health tool. And this is a companion project to Cedric. And this is a recognition that, you know, when I'm running the emergency department, I often get people saying, well, you've got queues of ambulances and there's lots of category 2 patients not been seen. And, you know, there's lots of those patients over there. Why is that? And I say, I have no idea whatsoever. And the reason I've got no idea whatsoever is because it is a complex, non-linear problem with multiple moving parts. And at any one time, you can't actually say what the cause is. So the only way to do this, basically, to try to get some sense of what's going to happen at the end of all this complex behavior, is not to assume that everything is linear and the same like this, but to realize that a hospital emergency department, a health service, is actually much more like that second one. And you cannot compute the end result of that by knowing only a small part of it. So how do we do that? Well, in CASH, what we're doing is using agent-based simulation. So we are characterizing every patient, every paramedic, every nurse, every doctor, every CT scanner and wheelchair as an agent with their own particular properties and the interactions between them. And then we're setting them free in an environment. We're setting them free in an environment like this. This is an ongoing representation of the agent-based model. And what you can do, each one of these has their characteristics and their interactions built into them. This is actually a floor plan of Liverpool Hospital Emergency Department. And in this, we're running our model, and we can alter various things here. We can alter the initial conditions, we can alter the staffing numbers, how sick the patients are. And then at the end of this, what we may see, we hope, is the end result in an hour or 12 hours or 24 hours or whatever. So, of course, though, systems like that need a lot of data. So the plan with CASH is that our Cedric, almost real time, because we think we can ingest data approximately every 5 minutes from the electronic medical record and link it together, will parameterize the agent-based model. And it will bring it, every time it does, it will bring it more and more towards real life. So when somebody asks it a question, then it will be much more likely to be able to give you something close to the truth. Now, I put in machine learning here, but really AI and machine learning fits in a long way back along the presentation I've been giving you, because we want to use, in specific terms, machine learning here for pattern recognition. So we want to look at using deep learning potentially, for instance, to look at patterns of presentation among many hundreds of thousands of patients in Cedric and look at predicting the outcomes associated with that. But similarly, we want to look at not only actual, but incipient and approaching patterns of failure within the agent-based model, and then use that to tell us when we should be doing something else. Now, cake, finally. CAKE is a comprehensive analytic knowledge and epidemiology platform. And that is essentially starting here, which you've seen already. It's starting with Cedric. I keep using these magician movies, so it shows you we're changing to something slightly different. But this is another way of looking at Cedric. Cedric, as we said, it brings all of these data sources together and in almost real time. And what we've done recently is that we've also started to ingest data from COVID testing clinics and the vaccination clinics. And that has given us a project where we're calling this the COVID Clinical Quality Registry. And we are collecting data from patients in there. We're also setting up automated language-specific messaging so that we can actually send a text message to people asking them to click on a link to be followed up with patient-reported outcome measures, etc. But really, this is generally in the hospital. So what we want to do, of course, is to follow COVID patients and indeed many other patients over time, whether it be weeks, months, or years. So what we're planning to do at the moment is we're building a multifunctional smartphone app. And that smartphone app, we call it the Swiss Army knife app because it's multifunctional and can do lots of different things. It's language specific, but it'll collect data of all types and then upload it longitudinally to the CAKE platform. So it can collect data at many different time intervals. And those data can be, and I didn't actually end up talking about pulse oximetry or heart rate variability, but it can collect data such as oxygen saturations, biomarkers, imaging, functional assessments by health professionals. And it can also then look at syndromes such as frailty and look at inflammation for biomarkers. And it can also then solicit data and feedback and information from patients themselves in terms of PROMs and PRONs. And we plan for this to be used as an ongoing platform to investigate long COVID, but also to allow many other things, which is to allow the collaboration of multiple groups to look at multiple aspects of chronic disease and in particular long COVID. As we said, that's the CAKE collaboration. That's the multiple stakeholders at the moment, which are based on the Sphere, which Mark is the executive director of, and other external partners as well. So essentially, CAKE captures comprehensive longitudinal data. We can evaluate the effectiveness of models of care. We can conduct pragmatic clinical trials using CAKE as a platform as well, and look at introduction of new interventions, support knowledge translation, evaluate effectiveness of implementation, and of course, which the Chief Finance Officer likes the idea of, is that we can do health economic evaluations of the models of care as well. And then what we're planning on doing is, as we roll this out, is to evaluate how we can scale this to multiple other collaborators, multiple other health districts, multiple other places, so that we can actually do the same job everywhere and connect the dots, connect the data together. So CAKE is a functioning big data platform. It's a multifaceted tool for data collection and trials. It's a multilingual resource, and it's a collaborative platform. And CAKE, of course, is for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And who doesn't like CAKE? Thank you for that. I think I can see some conversations between you and Robin happening after this one.
Written a name down to contact them.
Right, yeah, we're probably thinking the same thing. No, thank you to all our speakers. So we'll move into a panel session, but also where everyone who's got a question can ask their question. The first thing I'd like to do is we have two additional speakers on the panel, or participants on the panel. One on the Australian side is Jean Boudal. I've known John for quite a while. He's the Director and Head of Medical Devices and IVDs at PharmaLex Australia. For those of you who don't know PharmaLex, they're a global leading provider of specialised services for the pharmaceutical, biotech and medical devices industry, clearly specialising in quality and regulatory compliance. John himself has extensive experience in all phases of the product lifecycle, driving compliance from concept and blank sheet of paper, ideation through to commercialisation and post-market support. He provides reg and quality assurance expertise to a broad range of companies, with startups through to multinationals, and supports projects across multiple medical technologies. Might just have to stick your hand up, Sean, just to identify yourself. Can't see where you are on my screen.
Just here, Lance.
Oh,
Thanks
there
for
he
the
is.
introduction.
Sorry. And then Di, if you want to introduce Will, I can say Will.
Sure. Yes, so welcome, Will, to the panel discussion. Now, Will Hewitt is one of our startup stars in New Zealand, and he's the CEO and founder of HeartLab, a medical device company developing an AI-powered software for reporting scans of the heart, supporting cardiologists and sonographers to deal with the large amount of imaging data they have to go through. Will's much younger than I, but he has a huge background, a very long background in entrepreneurship, software and electronics engineering research, and a great sense of humor. And when he was part of the Auckland Bioengineering Institute Cloud9 incubator space, he brought great fun and joy to us. So welcome, Will. So maybe I'll start off with a question, actually. Will, what do you think is your, what has been your major challenge in the development of your AI?
I think I think the first big problem we came across, obviously there's sort of the technical problems as you sort of develop algorithms, but medical data, and especially in the imaging vertical, which we're in, it's as you sort of saw from the presentation before, it's an incredibly disparate set of systems that's difficult to integrate with well. And the blunt reality is that, clinicians aren't going to use your tool unless you specifically designed it to be a tool that fits into their workflow. And that can indeed, arguably that can even be a harder challenge than the actual algorithm development itself, is just developing the system and developing the tool that they'll use it within. So I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge that we've come across so far.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
If anyone wants to ask a question, just down the bottom of your screen, you've got the little reactions, and there's a little raise hand button that you can click on. So if you want to ask a question to that, and we'll pass you, and you can ask that live. Yusuf?
Hello, thank you very much for this wonderful meeting. I have a question about the accuracy. So like we are reporting that there are 70% accuracy, and the clinicians are very happy about it. But what is the governance criteria here? Like, because there isn't a clear control. In most of the studies, we have been asked to have a control group, and shouldn't these algorithms to overcome or outperform clinicians? So if we don't know if they are outperforming clinicians, even the 80% or even 85% accuracy may not be that much meaningful. So I have a question here, like even there are devices on the market right now working with 80% accuracy for sleep staging, and 20% is a great problem for multiple clinical conditions. So yeah, I have a question in means of governance, and what is the criteria here?
I think that might be a question for Robin to begin with, but then there might be a clinical aspect that Mark might want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots of aspects to that question, but and there's no set criteria from a governance perspective of a set number or anything like that, because it does very much depend on the actual clinical problem that you're trying to solve and how it's done currently, and how you can, as you saw, we do have criteria about being able to compare it to something to be able to say that it is as good as or better than than current practice, whatever that might be. So we will require the studies to look at kind of sensitivity and specificity against the current clinical practice, but we don't set an absolute number for that. It's very contextual and depends on the exact problem that you're dealing with. But others might like to talk about it from their perspectives.
I might actually just pass to Jill, because even in your study, even though I think it might have been on the recalibration of the LINAC, I think your physicists agreed that, well, yeah, 70% was great. So how did they come up to 70% was great?
So we started off with 60%, and he was really excited that we could get that sort of accuracy. And we were amazed because we were thinking that 80% from a computer science perspective made sense. I think that he was just thinking of it as a support. So because it wasn't a critical system, it's one that's supporting decision making. If there's a tool that will help give an indication and we can understand the possible accuracy, then he was going to find that useful.
Right. So genuinely
Okay.
decision support by definition.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. We've got a question from Surush.
Hi, Diana. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, Suresh is here from Auckland Boeing Engineering Institute. I have a question for Mark. It's very interesting stuff, a lot of synergies going on. My question, $1 million question is, how do you get the neurosurgeons to trust AI to act upon that? The results that you're getting, I mean, even if it's 99.99% accurate, neurosurgeon has its own expertise and opinion. So how do you get them to trust that AI to change the surgery?
Yeah. That's a fascinating question, Suresh, and I could talk all day about that because there's not only an element of proving accuracy, et cetera, that we just talked about, but there's also a substantial element of behavioural change. And that's not my area of expertise, but getting a neurosurgeon to change their behaviour is very difficult unless you offer them lots of money. But in terms of what we've done in the stroke field, I can tell you, and that gets back to Yusuf's question as well. There are a number of products out there on the market that use AI to detect clot, to measure lesion volumes, and their degree of accuracy is pretty low, actually. And I won't name them because sometimes they threaten to sue me.
Don't name them.
But the way around that, and I mean, a lot of you guys would know better than I, but to get a device registered, you don't need to show that it's superior to clinician assessment. You just generally need to, depending which jurisdiction you're in, you just need to show that it's equivalent to the current standard or whatever that might be. And what's happened in stroke is that a number of these devices have been used in clinical trials that have been positive, and it's nothing to do with the actual device, but because the clinical trials have been positive, they've sold and they've got FDA approval, they've sold lots of licenses for them. So actually showing that you're superior to a human, I think, is not necessary from a practical point of view. From a scientific point of view, it's nice. And in fact, to be honest, in stroke, showing that your AI prediction is more accurate than a human's easy. Human experts are pretty hopeless. And I'd suggest that's common in many areas of medicine and surgery. It's just that physicians and particularly surgeons often have a very high opinion of their own skills, often, and they overestimate it.
That actually raises a question, I think, for John. You talked about not having to be better than a human. So I guess, the appearance of AI on the scene, John, in terms of the quality and regulatory compliance requirements for all of that. How does what is the regulatory view of AI and becoming in a device, and is it regulated the same way? And what are the challenges that you've seen in them coming through?
There's lots of challenges with software in general, but AI even more so, and simply because the regulations have been established a very long time ago. We're basically working off some standards and regulations which have been established, say, from the 90s. And all of those technologies are so rapidly evolving, then the regulations are just catching up with, the new technologies and the advancements, right? The connectivity and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of guidance documents that are being published, particularly in the last, I would say, 6 years maybe. starting from the IMDRF, which is a working group of regulators involving, large regulators such as the FDA and smaller regulators as well. And where, there's a very strong focus on the regulations now in terms of processes. It's not just about the device, but it's also about the governance, the infrastructure that you've got around the organizational components, the planning phase, and one of the key challenges there is really the difference between, say, a simple hardware component, which is fixed in specification, and regulating an item which is forever evolving. That raises a lot of concerns and challenges in how you're going to be regulating this.
And that probably is a nice segue to another question for Will, actually. As a medical device company in AI, how has it been for you in your journey to regulatory approval?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly not a straightforward process by any means. And like the guy said before, you're essentially battling with a system that was designed for, initially it was designed just for hardware components, right? Which, has a very nice fixed specification. Then it was designed for software bolted onto a hardware component, which again, you can sort of relate back to the hardware you've built. So when you're building something like we're building, which is a purely software as a medical device, I mean, there's elements to the regulatory documentation where you actually just write, this is not applicable. This doesn't make sense in the context that we're applying it. So I think the biggest challenge, and really they're just asking you to justify your thinking. It's not typically it's not typically ridiculous. It's just, justifying the thinking, justifying decisions you've made, and showed that testing was sufficient to make it a safe and effective product. So yeah, it's certainly not been straightforward, but I think it's just a necessary process in the industry.
Okay, thanks. And what about you and Paul and Robin, your perspectives from a healthcare system? How do you deal with an AI that keeps changing as you're implementing it into the health system?
I might let Robin go first on that one.
When ladies first comes in handy.
Yeah, I was letting you take it. Yeah, no, it is very difficult. And we're only just getting to that point of having to really specify ongoing audit and monitoring and regular evaluation and what that means in terms of our agreements with people around AI. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of fishhooks in that as well. So a lot of AI, so you get the best and the worst of both worlds, because some of my answer to some of the previous questions was we make sure that clinicians and services are involved in the development of an AI, right? And that's part of our answer to how do you get it into practice, is that you have the services buy-in from the start. But then when you get to this question, you've got very invested clinicians then who are then responsible for the audit and monitoring of the AI in an ongoing way. And so they're not necessarily as independent as you would want in terms of ensuring that it continues to improve and to act as it should and is not introducing anything new, any unexpected consequences. So it's a real difficult balance that we're trying to run at the moment. I don't have any particular answers, but we're just making it up as we go along at the moment.
Okay, fair.
Yeah,
Paul, what about you?
I think from my point of view, what I talked about today was the restructuring of routine processes, I suppose, and then developing a novel layer, a novel dimension where we actually put data together that's not normally linked for a number of uses. And the logical next step for us is to introduce, say, machine learning of various types. But at the same time, we're taking our local health district on a journey where even what we're talking about is very foreign. And, one of my roles is to develop a data analytic governance strategy for the LHD. And, whilst developing that at one point where we're dealing with the sort of traditional ethical approval and the privacy, et cetera, at the same time, we're trying to deal with what we're talking about here, really, which is the introduction of artificial intelligence and all the well-recognized problems that go with that about interpretability and and about getting people to either stop being very anti and difficult and stop being too enthusiastic, overly enthusiastic, which, opposite ends of the spectrum, but both real problems. So I'm probably with Robin in saying that, we're making it up as we go along. We're trying to draw from the best sources, but construct something really, which is so new that every day we're thinking of something new to add to it or to adjust, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like there's probably, I'm not sure whether you and Robin have met, Paul, but sounds like there's a nice, good connection for the two of you in terms of making it up as you go, but also in terms of long COVID.
Yeah, I'll be on the phone later on. Yeah.
I think Sergey's virtual hand is getting really tired. So, again,
Great. Yeah, thank you for all the speakers. That was really appreciated. It was very, very interesting. This question is kind of related to Paul and Mark, and probably can be extended to a lot of other people. So there is a GE Healthcare is putting together a command center, a hospital command center. So it's kind of something very similar to what, Paul, you were talking about, kind of gathering all the data and be able to streamline decisions from up high. I'm just curious about, if this approach of kind of command centers could actually help with pipelining stroke patients, for example, as one. That's one question. And I guess if it would to happen, what do you think a timeline would be for that?
Yeah, look,
I'll let Paul take that one, Sergey.
Thanks. Yeah, look, this is a very apposite question because, this discussion is going on at the moment where we are. I suppose there's a couple of points that I would make. The first one is that we have a tendency, and I don't know if this is the same in New Zealand, but Australian healthcare has a real tendency to buy in. Now, with the greatest respect to my colleagues on this call who are essentially working in commercial enterprise, the temptation is always just to buy in something from a vendor that looks pretty and, the shiniest new ball. And the problem is with that, often they're not comprehensive and they're not linked to anything else almost by design. And they give an answer, but there may be many more answers that we really need as a health system. That's one aspect of it. So I very much believe we should be basing anything like a command center and all the rest on a recognition of what people are trying to solve, patient outcomes or running a health service, but looking at problems first and solving those as we go forward. The next thing I think is very, very, very obvious where we are is that people love dashboards. And I'm a fan of a picture over a page full of text any day, but really what happens is that people are sort of, desperate. They think the next thing they should have is a dashboard that tells them what's going on. But in the end, the decision-making, dashboards really tell you what, but not why. So people make the same decisions with a big shiny dashboard with lots of graphs on it that they did 5 years ago with a clipboard. The decisions are made by those people and their skills, their experience and their knowledge, but they still make that same decision. So sorry to sound as if I'm running off here, but really what I'm talking about is the concept of a command center. Apologies. The idea of a command center is really important, but a command center shouldn't just be a room full of big screens showing you what's happening right now. It should be education goes as part of this, moving forward to higher levels on the data analytic ladder, where you're talking about modeling, you're talking about prediction, you're talking about potentially prescription, and I don't think a command center is anywhere near as valuable as people think until you've built in the smart stuff. And a lot of this is going to be built around things like machine learning and AI to tell you not only why something happens, but even what you should do to prevent the next bad thing happening.
Funnily enough, Sergey, we've had discussions with GE about their command center, and they actually don't have a stroke tile, as they call it currently, which surprises me somewhat.
Yeah, I definitely think that integrating machine learning into that system would probably be the next step as well too.
Yeah,
I think if you actually look on the GE Command Center website, they talk about the shiny television screens and that sort of stuff. And then there's a link which says machine learning and AI, and you go to it and it says coming soon or something like that.
Hey, Ju, your virtual hand's starting to lose its blood flow as well.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. It's been super interesting so far. I'm Ju. I'm from Foremost Labs, another Auckland Bioengineering Institute spin-out company. We're in the orthopedic space. And I just want to sort of go back a question, this question around some of the regulatory challenges, but also ties into software. Well, I guess the issue, one of the issues we come across is what is an acceptable pace of change or improvement to the product, to the software, that's a good balance between, software best practices, which may be weekly or even every few days, there's a new release, there's a small update. And you might be used to this using like Facebook or Gmail or something like that, versus what's required to satisfy regulatory concerns versus what is comfortable for your users, particularly in a clinical setting. If your software is changing slightly on a day-to-day basis, whether that's the UI or even the performance of it, because let's say it is learning on the fly, is that actually going to be turning a lot of users off? Are people more comfortable with, say, quarterly updates or monthly updates? Is that a problem that people have come up before in the field? Thanks.
I can possibly speak a little bit to that, given, in a very similar spot to Ju, in that we found, I think there's a very big distinction here between the updates to an AI model and your updates to your actual software product, which usually, although tightly integrated, to a degree devolved, right? Usually your interface is to a degree removed from how your AI works. Now, I think a lot of the talk so far in the seminar, and also I guess in broader academia, is around iterating models on the fly. And I think that's a completely separate both safety, efficacy, and engineering concern to updating your product. For example, we've sort of landed on we can do like annual major releases with the FDA, but only monthly, minor changes, which for people from software engineering backgrounds, actually quite a slow cadence. And that's almost deliberately engineered pacing by regulatory bodies, essentially to make you think, right, and actually engineer something to make people slow down and think, especially when you get into something like human factors engineering, for example, which is the way you design your interface for clinicians. You, in many situations, actually trying to design something to make clinicians pause and think rather than making them miss something.
I think anything in that regulatory space, any conversation that comes up, it always seems to be how difficult it is. But I always kind of think, as consumers, we want it to be really rigorous, and difficult is probably not the right word. We want it to be rigorous and robust and does the right thing, which makes me think. I think for Sean, it's all about does it do what you say it's going to do, and it's not going to harm anyone. So risk. How do, unless you're all kind of experts in this space and you're like Will and Paul, how do the regulatory bodies kind of determine risk in software? How do they assess that and say, well, this is risky or this would be or not?
Yeah, so there's, sorry, no, whoever, I think we can both contribute, because there's a lot of points which I'll echo, which Will, you've already touched on. But one of the key things here is not every change will require some form of regulatory application, first of all, right? So there's significant changes are those that affect the intended purpose of the device. If it affects, the standard of care, if it affects, the detection mechanism or whatever, the software is intended to do. The key thing here is really from the start of or through your product development, as far as, as you progress through product development, you need to have some form of plans, predetermined control plans for what significant changes are going to look like, and at which point in time you're going to be notifying the regulator of what forms a significant change. So, what sort of data you're going to be collecting, how you're going to be collecting the data, what's the infrastructure. If you present, if you like, that sort of what I like to call a design envelope to the regulator, that's basically pre-approved. You've constrained the limitations of your approval to a body of evidence. You've presented a body of evidence which is representative of a number of changes that may occur, and that prevents you from actually notifying the regulator on every single instance of product iterations.
Right. So this is the one that keeps me awake at night, and Will, John, Robin, you may have a view on this as well. So if we take machine learning as it actually is, we understand how that works in developing algorithms. But with machine learning, so if an algorithm is approved by a regulatory body that is locked in a particular place, but machine learning kind of adapts as it gets more data and ideally gets better at what it's doing. But if it changes to what a regulatory body approved, how is that managed? Can there be a place for machine learning in actual healthcare delivery?
So
it's changing.
My understanding is that every algorithm that's been approved to date has not. So there is a subset of algorithms, which is what you just described, which is continuous learning, right? So you have to specifically engineer algorithms to perform like that. So I believe all of the, I'm not an authority, so I may be wrong, but I believe all the algorithms that have been approved to date are not of the continuous learning variety. They're all ones that are static, frozen in time. Unless you were to retrain that model, it will, you give it the same input, you'll get the same output every time.
Yeah, which we all understand. And yeah, go, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a bit of a spectrum, right? So I think the important point we're talking about here is those that have those kinds of locked algorithms compared to those that are continuously adaptive. So there's a lot of processes that are currently being developed, and those programs are still evolving. I think it's fair to say that the regulator that has published, most of the body of the work in this space is probably the FDA. They're implementing a lot of programs that look not just at your traditional kind of pre-market data of collecting, okay, these are my design specifications, my plans, etc. They're also looking at pre-certifications of companies, where they'll be looking at, for instance, your quality management system as a whole, how the company is governed, what sort of training mechanisms are in place, and also the post-market data, right? So through those algorithms, you're going to be continuously collecting a certain amount of data. What sort of data? How frequently? Through what systems, etc. You would be presenting basically those plans to the regulator. They're going to provide clearance or approval for your medical device on the basis of those plans. And there will be routine checks, say by the form of audits or verification of additional body of data that's collected along the way. And this is how you basically stay up to date with your approval.
Thank you, everyone, for those questions. Can I, to deviate from the regulatory side of it, and this is more for the users. So let's say the product is meeting all its regulatory requirements in these updates. From a user point of view, what do users want to see to have confidence that the software is still performing as it should? Because as some of the earlier talks around some of the specific models have kind of noted, is that a machine learning model can learn unexpected patterns and still come out with the same result. So let's say the algorithm has learned to figure out that, or learn that healthy patients have a heart rate that it's a multiple of 4, but it's giving reasonable results. Is that a concern for users?
Yeah, I think there's lots of aspects to that again, Drew, that, so yeah, one I was going to say on the last one, it's not just about things that are continuously learning and changing. It's also that things can actually deteriorate over time, even if you're not changing them. So you do need to have a continuous audit and monitoring program so that you can make sure that something that is static and has been approved is not actually giving you strange results, slowly moving away over time. So you do need to do that. In terms of clinicians, from my perspective, and then others might put theirs forth, but I mean, our clinicians are very happy with change if change means that you are making their lives easier. So if you're making something quicker, if you're making it less clicks, if you're making it more integrated, as Will said, so you're making their daily practice easier, then it's not that they're change resistant. If you're making something easier for them to do, then in our experience, they seem to be reasonably happy with rapid change. But it's the decision making, right? It comes back to that whole criticality of clinical decision making, and if the AI is changing something, substantial in terms of their understanding of the result that they're being given, and that they are then making a clinical decision around diagnosis or treatment on, then they require quite a high level of evidence to say that something should change, right? Because again, mostly if you've still got a clinician making the decision, they're still mostly making it on their own clinical judgment and gut feeling. But if the more and more they come to rely on something from the machine providing them the information to make that decision on, the higher that level of evidence and burden of proof is around a small change to it. So if you're, there's so many different types of AI, it's quite hard to talk in generalities, but if in general the AI is understandable enough that they understand what are the key inputs and why they're important, and those things don't change, then that's kind of, to me, the level of understanding that is required. If it gets to the point where they no longer understand why they're getting the kind of results because it doesn't seem to make sense to them in terms of the key inputs, the key data, then that's where you'll kind of lose them in terms of, no, you have to do another study to show me why this is good before I will use it. Does that kind of answer your? Yeah,
no, that was super helpful. Thanks, Robin.
I would add, there's a whole field I talked about before in implementation science and behavioural change that you can get into, which then sometimes can circumvent the need to provide high-level evidence. If you have clinicians involved in the co-design and then the early implementation, then often they'll be your champions, the so-called early adopters, and convince a lot of their colleagues to use it. So I think there's a couple of ways you can go about it. It's quite an interesting field, actually. But yeah, again, not really my area of expertise, but we've obviously had some experience with working with various end users with various software and AI related devices and how it might change their practice.
Yeah, no, I think for me, what we've sort of come to is as much as a product development question as it is a technical.
Yes,
question.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll stop asking questions.
That's good to see you. Jill, you were nodding ahead there. You had something to add?
So Drew, just following up on that, we've got, white box and black box models. And so, everyone's really keen on deep learning, but it's really difficult to understand what's going on there. And so often that's why we will try decision trees first, because it does give us some idea of which features are being used in our model and which are the important features. Also, when we're designing these decision support systems, we do try and provide some sort of visual feedback so that people can understand what is going on. And that's what I liked about the brain before in the previous talk, that, we had these heat map type things so that we could actually see blockages. So I think that data visualization part, that explainability part, really does help in the trust, on the trust side of things.
Yeah, Gil, can I immodestly say that that's because clinicians like me were involved from the start of that software being developed and telling the developers what we wanted to see. And as Paul alluded to, clinicians love a dashboard and a pretty picture. And not as much as health service managers or other people, that buy software do, though.
Any other questions from participants? Oh, Aaron.
Yes, hi, Aaron Croft, also from Formus Labs. I was just going to comment on Jill's comment. And often explainability comes at the expense of accuracy. So I wonder if there's a call on how important accuracy is versus that explainability.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. And so what we ended up with was a user interface for the second project that I was talking about. And I was really trying to push for some way of explaining what we were doing. But then we made that call there that accuracy was more important. So that's definitely the trade-off.
So the question I got for each of the speakers, I commented previously about what keeps me awake at night, and that nothing near as technical as what you're thinking about for people or practitioners who are working in the space. What are the questions that you have about AI, implementing AI, that you'd like answered, or are there things that government support would do to help answer the queries or the difficult areas that you've got? With whoever wants to go first.
Oh, well, I'll jump in.
Thanks, Robin.
I think there's lots of things that are still to really be worked through to any great detail. In New Zealand, we've still got a long way to go with the software regulatory work, which is an issue. But just around accountability as well is another big one, I think. So that being really clear on where accountability and liability lies, like nobody's kind of thought through a lot of this in New Zealand yet. We've been trying to talk to ACC and medical indemnity insurance and people like that about decisions that are made that are a combination of a clinician and an AI, and where does accountability lie. So with that old adage that when you're relying on a clinician to make a decision, no one can explain to a patient how that clinician is making a decision. It's the biggest black box that there is. Other than, I've seen lots of patients before, and this is my feeling. But each of those decisions that an individual clinician is making affects one individual patient. Whereas when you start to introduce AI into the clinical decision-making process, you're potentially able to impact a huge number of patients with one potential, error in a code somewhere, or that's something that goes a bit rogue. I mean, that's the extreme, but that's the kind of detail that I don't think that we've really had a lot of those discussions around on a national scale yet in New Zealand. I don't know about Australia.
I would say there's the other end of the spectrum to consider as well. So as much as having large-scale discussions about the principles, it's absolutely fundamental to understand the granular scale of clinicians' work. And I agree that many clinicians, their cogitation and their decision-making is very much a black box. However, I think it's really fundamental to understand as well about all of the details about clinicians and how they work, which is not always easy for people who are outside, because, if you think about it, typically, if you speak to somebody like Mark or myself, then, we are specialists in an area which has taken 5, 10, 15, 20 years to get to. And in theory, our decision-making is maybe the best it's going to be. But most decision-making and most of the place for machine learning and AI potentially in medicine is not for us. It may be for people who've been out of medical school for 2 years or 5 years or 1 year or whatever it may be, because they're the people who are desperately trying to, sort of incorporate logical decision making and algorithms into their brain to be able to recognize clinical syndromes and do the right thing at the right time. And, you know, so medicine is very heterogeneous. And I think sometimes from the outside, it looks the opposite. It looks like it's a homogeneous thing and you're trying to solve a discrete problem instead of actually give a tool to a clinician that needs maybe a very different level of assistance. And I think that's fundamental. And the other part that's fundamental as well is if you think that what the AI community is exponentially starting to be able to deliver is a very sophisticated tool to use, it's subject to the same rigors of every other tool and every other innovation. And you know, the evidence-based medicine paradigm has been around now for sort of 30 years, you know, and many specialties, and certainly mine, are absolutely driven by having it proved to be working and to be useful first before you just jump into it. And there's been a long history in the past of people doing things without thinking very carefully about it and not really implementing it and looking at the outcomes or any change in outcomes. So I would say, sort of in summary, that has to be taken into account. You have to think about what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and how you're going to measure the outcomes to demonstrate it's something they should be adopting. And that's leaving aside all the things about black boxes and interpretability.
Another speaker, otherwise we got a question from Sujane.
Hi everyone. Sorry, my video is off because my computer is terribly slow today. So the question kind of relates to Robin's and Paul's suggestions now. So I work for ESR as a commercialization manager. So we also deal a lot of, you know, software development, not software development, but solutions for healthcare and other areas. So the question I had was, instead of trying to replace the decision making from a clinician perspective, when we develop these kind of softwares or AI or any other medical devices for healthcare, would it be a good idea to give the information, a complete information to the clinician and let them make the decision? Let's say, for example, if we are doing any diagnostics, for example, and then we give them, you know, a complete spectrum of diagnosis that could be made, but let them make the decision. Would that, from a regulatory perspective, would that be a better way of approach for commercialization, or, you know, integrating the products into the healthcare system?
Yeah, I can start off, Sujane. Thanks. Well, I think I made it very careful in my talk to say that we're talking about decision support or decision assistance. We're not talking about replacing clinicians. And that's exactly what we do. We provide information and obviously volumetric information in stroke, but we're working on more sophisticated models that include clinical variables that then might give you a prediction of the likely response to treatment. So that opens up a whole new area because, for example, we've got we've been looking at various models that predict response to clot retrieval treatment. And if, for example, it says the chance of a good response is 50%, the chance of an adverse outcome is 20%, well, is that good enough to go ahead with? So ultimately, it's left to a decision between the clinician and the patient and or their family, depending on the situation. And it also brings up lots of ethical issues around what's a fair and acceptable outcome. So if you look at these things purely from a health economic point of view, if you've got a treatment, if you've got a decision assistance algorithm that's saying this treatment you're offering has a reasonably high risk of death, but there's less chance of ending up seriously disabled. Well, that means it's a very cost-effective outcome. Either way, if they survive without disability or the patient dies. So what are the ethics around that? So there are all sorts of other issues that brings up, which are subject to another discussion. But yeah, I think, Sujane, if you're talking about use of AI and machine learning, it's really in decision assistance and support, and that's then means you probably need a less higher level of evidence that, to get it approved and get it into clinical practice. Then it's all around what I said, co-design. Do the clinicians find it acceptable to see this information to help them make a decision? And like, for example, the pretty color maps that I showed you, they're incredibly informative to show to patients and their families in the ED, because in the old days, as Paul knows, not that he's old, but you know what I mean, we only had non-contrast CT, right? So when you do a non-contrast CT in acute stroke, you often can't see anything. So you'd go to the family, and usually, because the patient's often not really got the capacity, and say, oh, it looks like, you know, your dad's having a really big stroke. We can't see it on the scan, but we're going to give them this treatment that might cause them to bleed and die. What do you think? So now we can actually show them these maps of how much brain's salvageable and how much is dead. And if there's a big area of salvageable brain, you say, look, if we don't give the treatment, all of this brain will die. And yes, there's a small risk of complications if we give it, but the risk of not giving the treatment's much worse, because this is what will happen if we don't. Before, it was purely a trust thing, how well you could sell the treatment to the patient and family, which is still often the case in most clinical practice, to be honest with you.
I agree that you have to, I think co-design is essential because a mistake that's often made, and it's not just AI, it's in other technology, is that people do something because they can. And then they talk to a clinician and they're saying, don't really need that. Or it doesn't actually help, but hinders. It makes processes slower or whatever. You know, there are many, many things that we don't know and that we really need. And certainly things like the recognition of subtle and complex patterns is absolutely one of them. So, you know, the use of tools to help us understand that there's all these things going on that we can't necessarily see with our eyes is fundamentally, and is where I think the real use, in at least in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, of machine learning goes. It's about giving us tools which make us better at using our skills and our knowledge. I don't think it's about taking over from us, because, you know, that black box that Robin referred to, you know, that does actually, there's recognition of a constellation of things that are happening is essential to medicine, and providing a tool is far more useful, I think, than trying to come up with something that does the same job.
Until we can upload our black box brains to the cloud, Robin, I think we're safe.
Yeah. But I'm often amazed that, you know, that AI, a lot of AI research and development work has gone straight for the most difficult thing in medicine, which is diagnosis. You know, should I say that again? Yeah. So I'm amazed that that most of the AI research and development effort has kind of gone straight for the most difficult thing in medicine, which is diagnosis. You know, like there's so many other things that we could use AI and data for, in like helping to run our hospitals, that would be just as equally useful for us and less risky and less difficult to get into practice probably. But everyone is mainly interested in helping with diagnosis.
Strangely enough, that was what Mark said to me when I spoke to him about this topic. It wasn't about brain imaging, it was about the health service delivery.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe that's for Will and Drew to pick up at some other point in time as a side gig. But Will and Sean, have you got some last comments around you know, what are the ethical challenges that you see, both of you?
Or was that directed at me?
The ethical challenges in terms of AI implementation or AI.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest one really is the one Robin touched on before, which is, you know, making sure no one gets left behind, right? Which is essentially, you know, if you take the straightforward approach, if you take a dump of a data set from somewhere and train a model from that, inherently the way statistics works is you will perpetuate any inequities that was in that existing data set through to whatever model you train, right? So, and you know, this is a problem we can engineer around, fortunately, which is, you know, a more fortunate situation than trying to address health inequities across the health system as a whole. At least in this very specific situation, we can do something about it, right? Which is, you know, it's in engineering speak, you call it class imbalance, you know, adjustment. So, you know, you artificially increase the size of a certain data set to be able to better cater to that side of the data set. So I think I think making sure we do that well and we actually think about that along the way. And I think that's one of the advantages, especially in New Zealand, right? Which is, look, typically a lot of this technology is not developed here in New Zealand, to a large extent in Australia either, right? Which means that the populations which are typically left behind here will continue to be left behind when it's not getting developed here. So I think the opportunity to do some of that work here is pretty exciting.
Great, thanks, Will. Sean?
Look, I think, from most of the topic on the ethics has really been well covered by everybody. But the only point I was going to make was in terms of going back to that previous question, should we limit it to decision making or, decision support? I think when I'm just providing the regulatory perspective, the framework actually accommodates for the whole spectrum of, what sort of disease you're going to be targeting and what sort of information you'll be providing to the physician. So it's really the case of, as you said, and I think some of the presenters also talked about this, is it actually legitimate to utilize AI for certain aspects of the care practice or not? So I think even before we're trying to look at the feasibility, there's probably a bit of a decision to be made as to, all right, is that actually the right solution for, the right level of treatment for the disease state, for, the type of information I want to provide. So yeah, up to the developers and the collaboration with the specialists, but at some level of human intervention is probably going to always be necessary, I would imagine, at least for a number of years.
Thanks, Sean. We're just about out of time, so just so we have enough time to let everyone get away. A few takeaways for me. Hopefully everyone's got some takeaways themselves. One, bit of a surprise to me wasn't so much the difficulty in the technical area, but it sounded like the implementation of products or something with AI seems to be the most difficult area, but involving the clinicians early on seemed to be a way of mitigating some of those problems. We also need to have some discussions with all the relevant bodies around where the accountabilities lie. So kind of the takeaways for me, obviously there's a lot of stuff in there and it's only going to grow. Want to thank everyone for participating, in particular thank our speakers, Jill, Robin, Andrew and Mark, the combo, Paul, John and Will coming in on the panel as well. And I'll just take my opportunity to thank Ella for helping organise all of this as well. Di and I spoke with Ella yesterday and said it wouldn't be anywhere near as good without her help. And just a reminder, those people working in any of these spaces may not be one of the speakers today, but you feel like you've got something to offer to collaborate with somebody, just connect with Di or myself and we can help make that happen. So that's the last for me, and I'll hand over to Di to finish everything up. Thanks, Di.
Okay, thanks, Lance. Yeah, I just want to join in and say thank you very much to all our speakers. One of the very clear takeaways from me was repeated quite a few times by Mark, actually. So, you need a clinician by your side in the development of not just AI, but all technology, if it's going to be really relevant to the health system. And it looks to me as well that we've all talked about diagnosis here, but as Robin pointed out, and possibly what Paul's kind of looked at as well, is actually how do you use technology to support more efficient processes in the health system. So yeah, just reminding you that Ella kindly sent out a whole lot of bios of the people attending today, and that was really to help you with some virtual networking, because there's a whole lot of people on our Zoom at the moment. Some have dropped off, but really it was just so that you could see who's on board and interested in this topic. And if you are wanting to connect, you've got their details, or yeah, as Lance said, come back to Ella, Lance or I, and we'll help. So yeah, we've finished 1 minute to 3:30. Thank you very much, everyone in New Zealand and Australia, and have a very nice rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.